Matthew, welcome to the Future of Gaming. Thanks ever so much for taking the time. Before we get started, why don't you tell us a bit about you and the company that you founded?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for having me. So I am co-founder of a company called Latope. We represent a number of different high-profile Latin American football players that play across Europe.
Okay, and obviously we're going to get into the gaming piece in a sec, but give us a bit of an overview in terms of how you work with football players in a more general and broad sense.
Yeah, so we work with football players ultimately to develop their brand and commercial partnerships. The easiest way to probably explain it is we focus on everything that doesn't involve moving the player from club to club. So that's anything from social content creation to sourcing new global ambassador partnerships for our players, launching players across different social platforms in different territories, and everything else in between.
Okay, so I guess this is very much born from, the social media culture and the fact that players now are able to attract such huge audiences in their own right. Give us a bit of a flavour in terms of the types of players that you work with, maybe some of the projects you've done with those players.
Sure. So we've got players that cover a number of different territories across South America as their heritage. So we've got players in Douglas Costa, who is the Juventus winger. We've got Eric Lamela, the Tottenham midfielder. Davinson Sanchez, Colombian and Tottenham centre-back, who's also an investor into our business. Manuel Lanzini from West Ham, Carlos Sanchez from West Ham, and a few other players as well.
Okay, so you're ultimately the go-between between these guys and working with an advertiser, with a brand. We can talk around, more how the bigger approach to it works, but if we take it back to, what the theme of this event is all about with gaming, and we can start with the obvious place, FIFA. So I think the oldest one I can remember is 97 with David Ginola on the front cover. That seems an obvious thing. Football game gets a football player to front the cover, but how has just in that space, just the football game space, how has that evolved, and how does that include the players now?
Yeah, I mean, look, FIFA have worked hand in hand with the players for as long as I can remember, and will always continue to do so. There's obviously a natural fit between football players and football games. So FIFA do an incredible job each year on their different launches, with, as you mentioned, their players on the front cover, and that changes depending on territory as well. They run sort of event launches for their games. They've got their FIFA stats cards, which get talked about a lot with the players. These are the stats, obviously, that rate them on their shooting, dribbling, heading, etc. But it causes a natural conversation between the players because some of the time they think they deserve higher stats. As competitive people they are, they always want the best ones. So, but yeah, I mean, they will always continue to work hand in hand. I think what we found recently, especially in this lockdown period, we've worked with a number of different gaming publishers, but a wider genre of games, with Garena and their Free Fire title, where we work with a couple of players to run a charity campaign. So we're seeing a bit of a trend in terms of the sort of not traditional gaming titles wanting to work with football players to drive that cut through and get access to the football players' wider audience.
And this is about when we're talking gaming publishers, we're talking about them as a brand, as an advertiser that want to sell their product, aren't we? Utilising a player, and for want of a better word, I suppose, to describe them, they're an influencer because of their reach. So tell me a bit about maybe some of the gaming publishers that you've worked with, and how the players helped, promote a non-sporting game.
Yeah, so we worked, as I mentioned, with Garena. So they are a Singapore-based publisher. We worked with them recently with James Rodriguez and David Ospina. So we secured both those guys to take part in a charity campaign where they went head-to-head, which was live streamed on YouTube. So they wanted to work with these guys to ultimately help drive the campaign, which is around children's welfare. So we help by activating across those two players' social channels to drive viewership. And then the game was live streamed on YouTube for all to see.
And what other examples have you got then when a gaming publisher has come to you to use a football player to promote their game, and why? Why a football player?
I think as another example, we're actually working with Warner Brothers and have been for a little while now, specifically around football talent. So we've got an activation tomorrow with Douglas Costa, who will be battling it out with a high-profile DJ. So stay tuned to see who that one is. But I think, look, ultimately, wider publishers are realizing that football players have such a vast amount of following. They have deep engagement. Consumers love to see what football players are doing away from football pitch, which ultimately is where our strategies are born from. We have individual player strategies, and we focus on passion points for these guys. And gaming is obviously at the heart of a lot of our clients' passions. So they understand that we can obviously showcase the data back to these brands in terms of following demographic, and they're seeing that actually football players can hit that sort of niche audience, that 18 to 35 year old target that they're after.
And when we were chatting before we obviously started the interview here, you were talking through, I guess, the relevance of a particular player to whatever brand it is that's representing, which obviously makes a lot of sense if you know anything about influencer marketing. So what you would do ordinarily wouldn't just be in the gaming space. You go across a wide range of different types of media channels and different platforms. A lot of it is content creation. So just give us a bit of an idea in terms of how that works, and then why, I suppose, during this lockdown period, you've noticed a real spike in getting some of your clients involved in the gaming world.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, our focus has been around working across a number of different sectors for our players. So really identifying, as I mentioned earlier, those passion points of players, whether that's fashion, whether that's food, whether that's culture, and shaping partnerships with brands and media around those passion points. And that could include anything from IP usage, so use of a player's image, players creating content, so having set days for content creation where we'd send camera crews down and capture all the content required for the brand. And then social activation with the content captured, then amplified across the players' channels. So we do that across a vast range of sectors that we identify player by player. But yeah, in the lockdown period, obviously that hasn't been possible to get out and physically film with the players. So we've seen the trend in terms of gaming, and not just, as I mentioned, football games, but wider genre of games wanting to work with footballers, because footballers know how to create content, especially in the gaming world. These guys are actually really, really good at gaming. They're very competitive when they play these games. It's not just competitive on the football pitch, it's competitive in everything they do, which is how they got to where they are on a professional stage as football is. So they take it very seriously, the gaming. So it sort of goes hand in hand with our guys at the moment.
And what's the process, I suppose, when you're talking to the football player in terms of the type of brands that they want to work with? Because they're not going to work with, I presume there's got to be a passion there, and gaming is an obvious one. I suppose you can't have a football player that doesn't play games getting involved in the gaming world. So I imagine, you know, some of the players that you're talking about, you mentioned obviously the charity gig that you did. We mentioned one, I think, around Mortal Kombat as well with Eric Lamela and beforehand.
Yeah.
I imagine Eric Lamella's got to have a passion for that particular game before he gets involved in that. And how do you then how do you get that information across to the brand? Is it your role to approach a particular brand on his behalf?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't expect Eric Lamela to pick up the phone to the marketing director of Mortal Kombat. We would do that on his behalf. But we obviously know our players. We know what they like, what they don't like. We know what games they're playing. We have a direct relationship with these guys, so we speak with them almost every day, really to unearth more sort of more of understanding about what these guys like to do, want to do, so we can create that sort of narrative. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We wouldn't want Eric Lamela to go out in the first round of a celebrity tournament because he couldn't play the game. Eric does play the game, likes the game, so we were able to showcase that to Mortal Kombat, who were planning this celebrity tournament.
So I suppose what a lot of people wouldn't necessarily normally understand, because you'd think maybe it's quite obvious just to go and get a footballer to endorse maybe a product, but in this scenario, I guess, as you said, Mortal Kombat never would have maybe thought of picking up the phone to Eric Lamela, as sure as I'm sure a lot of Tottenham fans would like to see him play the particular game. But what's that process then when you're having to talk to them about saying, you should have Eric Lamela taking part in an activation which is promoting your game? Do they immediately think you're a bit nuts? First of all, what do you have to feed into them to convince them that's the right thing to do?
Yeah, I think. I mean, we wouldn't force a player down their throat. I think there's a bit more science behind it. We speak to brands and media agencies about football per se and football influencers per se. We obviously have a roster of talent on sort of the Latope books, but we have access to a number of different footballers too. So we would firstly understand exactly what the objective is for brand, what the campaign requirements are, understanding what the brand really wants to get out of this, what the key territories are, what the demographics are. And we've got access to our players' Instagram, and we actually work with the system that overlays on that Instagram, so we can pull data out that we can actually then showcase back to brand to say, actually, look, you've said you want to hit this demographic, you want this region. We have that player, and it's in this player, and here are the reasons why. So there's a lot of different moving parts in terms of when we identify which player is right for a campaign. But first, we obviously understand what the brand requirements are, what their objectives are, and then we will then work sort of backwards, as opposed to you should be doing this because we're telling you to do this. It's not quite like that.
Sure. One of the interesting things I think that you said to me offline, which I caught on to, was the fact that some of your players, your clients now, are increasingly getting more involved with esports. And yes, on one hand, it's because that they've got a passion for gaming, but actually there's a real business sense behind this. Can you talk us a bit through like the involvement of some of your clients in the esports world?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a massive difference between your gamer and then esports, or your e-gamer, if you like, because you've got the casual gamers, which some of our clients have. Casual gamers, they have to be pretty good at some of them, but others are just like me and you, Steve, pick up a control pad and get beaten. But so I think there's a difference between gamer and fair dues. We'll have a game of FIFA after this. So in terms of the esports world and the e-gaming world as such, one of our clients in Douglas Costa has his own e-gaming team. So he sits slightly different to our other clients in terms of they have a passion for gaming, absolutely. But Douglas owns his own team, of which he's got about 8 players that play under the DC team name. So they're predominantly a Fortnite team, but they enter competitions. And Douglas has a real passion to drive that business forward and to develop his team for success.
And that's really interesting because obviously there's a number of different paths a professional footballer can take, going management, coaching. I'm sure maybe that's something he will take, but we also know that footballers have a number of other business interests. That, to me, kind of, when you hear that someone's investing their time and their money into something like that, should be enough to make people sit up and take notice. When you talk to a Douglas Costa or any number of your clients on your roster, are you seeing an increase in more of your clients now looking towards gaming and esports?
Yeah, I think specifically in terms of Douglas Costa, like I said, he's got a real passion behind this. I mean, on his Instagram, he will heavily promote his DC team, which has its own separate Instagram page. But we're getting more and more involved in that part of the world with Douglas. We're actually launching a new product, e-gaming product, with Douglas and DC teams. So that launches in July. It's been many months of work, but we're finally there, which we're really excited about. But again, it'll be another flag in the ground on how serious Douglas takes gaming and specifically his gaming team.
And can you tell us anything more about that, or is that a little bit under wraps at the moment?
A little bit. You'll have some drip feed news over the next few weeks, so I'll send it on as soon as I get it.
Okay, fine. So one of the last things I guess I wanted to ask, where you sit within your particular business that you've co-founded there, what would be the one thing you would say to an advertiser, to a media agency, why they should come and speak to you guys in terms of understanding the world in which you operate in, and also what you can do for the advertiser?
Yeah, I think, look, I think there's probably a misconception in terms of footballers have a focus on football and that's it. Look, obviously it's their job, it's what they get paid to do, it's what they do very well, but they do have a lot of other passions that people don't know about. And I think it's our job to almost educate the market and brands and media agencies to let these guys know that our clients are interested in this fits with a brand that you might be working with at a media agency, and how we can actually then create some really good content with player and specific brand that falls into a player's passion point, because football players are huge influencers. When football players post, I mean, people sit up and listen, and that's why we did a lot around the charity work within lockdown. With Mortal Kombat and Free Fire, they all had charity angles. One to combat COVID was Mortal Kombat. So I mean, players want to give back, and I think what we're trying to get across to media agencies is that think of footballers as influencers, because they can really sort of cut through and rapidly drive awareness, perception, credibility for a brand, and specifically in gaming, downloads and purchases.
And I guess a great thing with the footballers is, by and large, most of them fit into that category of Gen Z. And when we're talking gaming, even though in this event itself, we've covered how the gamer can be quite broad in terms of who they are, by and large, I think we look at it as them being Gen Z. So there's a real synergy there between the consumer and the player.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And again, that's where we're able to showcase that data that sits behind a player, that sits alongside passion points. So we can then actually have a more scientific conversation, if need be, around which players work best for which brands and versus that required audience.
Okay, well, look, brilliant. We're almost out of time. Matthew, thanks ever so much for joining us today. Hope lockdown is treating you well, continues to treat you well, and catch up with you soon.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.